Welcome to The Explainer. I know exactly why you clicked on this title. You saw it, and your brain instantly rewarded you just for intending to learn something deep. You probably feel a little bit smarter already, right? Well, today we're looking at a fascinating and frankly kind of confrontational piece of writing. It takes a really hard look at our daily digital habits. We're talking about a phenomenon that affects, honestly, every single one of us who loves to consume information online. It completely challenges the very foundation of how we think we learn.
So I want you to sit with a question for a second. Are you actually acquiring a new skill right now? Or are you just getting high on the feeling of accumulating information? I mean, we live in this absolute golden age of content, right? Anyone can pull up a 10-minute breakdown of string theory, a masterclass on chess strategies, or some deep dive into macroeconomics. But this abundance, it's created a massive psychological trap, and we need to turn the mirror on ourselves immediately. Because that sense of mastery, that feeling of knowing, is actually often completely false.
Okay, let's dive into this. The source text actually calls this core problem the expertise mirage. It's basically the fatal mistake of confusing the passive consumption of online breakdowns for the actual acquisition of real skill. You know the feeling. You watch someone effortlessly assemble a car engine or code a website, and somehow your brain tricks you into thinking, oh yeah, I know how to do that now. We are literally substituting the act of watching for the act of doing, and the result? Our actual capability remains totally stagnant, even while our internal confidence just skyrockets. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of the illusion we're living in. It's staggering. On one hand, you've got our perceived expertise, what the author aptly calls shallow fluency. We watch a well-produced documentary and boom, we suddenly feel fluent in the topic. But then look at the other side. Compared to our actual real-world application, it's almost non-existent. It's just a stunning representation of our inflated intellectual egos compared to what we can actually execute when we're forced to step away from the screen and, do the hard work. So why do we fall into this trap so easily, day after day? Well, it really comes down to our biological reality. The source points out that our modern digital habits are fundamentally hacking our brains. They're blurring the lines between a cheap thrill and actual learning. We're dealing with two very different biological processes here, and confusing one for the other is exactly what keeps us stuck in that mirage. So let's look closer at these two mechanisms to see what's actually happening inside our heads. Think about it. When you watch an expertly crafted video that simplifies some highly complex topic, your brain gets this massive surge of dopamine. Let's be honest, it feels amazing. You add another 3-hour coding tutorial to your Watch Later playlist, and you instantly feel like a genius. It feels like a genuine breakthrough. But, as the source explicitly warns us, we mistake that immediate, fleeting dopamine rush for the hard-won neurological rewiring of actual practice. Real skill acquisition physically changes your brain. It builds brand new neural pathways. But here's the catch. That rewiring doesn't happen when you're just sitting back and watching. It only happens through physical or mental repetition, through trial, and through failure. Let's move forward and see how this builds, because this biological confusion leads to a dangerous behavioral shift. We actively substitute passive consumption for cognitive strain. Think about the difference there. Passive consumption is incredibly easy, right? Zero stakes, zero risk. You just let the information wash over you. But real learning, that demands cognitive strain. It demands that uncomfortable, deeply frustrating feeling of not knowing the answer, the struggle of holding a complex concept in your mind, of trying and failing to execute a technique. When we avoid that strain by retreating to the comfort of passive consumption, we are just actively sabotaging our own growth. Now, there is a literal philosophical gut punch in the source text that perfectly summarizes this. By substituting passive consumption for cognitive strain, we, and I quote, build a fragile intellectual ego that collapses under the first sign of real-world application. Just let that sink in for a second. Think about a time you confidently explained a concept you'd literally just watched a video about, only to completely freeze when someone asked you a basic follow-up question. Or when you tried a new recipe or workout move you saw online and just failed miserably. That is the collapse. That is the mirage shattering the second it hits the brick wall of reality. So the crucial point is, how do we fix this? How do we stop being a professional consumers and actually become practitioners? Well, the text doesn't just leave us hanging with the problem. It gives us an antidote, and it begins with a conscious, deliberate choice to dismantle this illusion. We have to recognize our fragile intellectual ego for exactly what it is and start tearing it down. We have to stop letting our brains trick us into thinking we've accomplished something real just because we, reached the end of a playlist or read an article.
And what's really interesting here is how we actually enact that antidote. The source gives us a very specific instruction. We must actively choose to prioritize friction over effortless, shallow fluency. Shallow fluency feels smooth. Friction feels incredibly rough. Friction is the frustration of practicing a chord on the guitar until your fingers blister. Friction is staring at a blank page and writing a terrible first draft instead of just reading yet another book on how to write. Listen, if what you're doing feels entirely effortless, you are probably stuck in the mirage. You absolutely have to actively seek out the friction, because friction is the only place where that neurological rewiring actually takes place.
Which brings us to the ultimate test. You've just watched another breakdown. You've consumed more information. The dopamine has been successfully delivered to your brain. But based on everything we've just seen from the source material, that means absolutely nothing unless you take the next step. So here's my final question for you. Will you close this explainer right now and go face some actual friction? Or are you going to just scroll to the next piece of content and let the mirage continue? The choice and the cognitive strain that comes with it is entirely yours.